So you want to turn your line art into painted portraits? Or you've started the journey, but it's looking a little bit like mush? Well, I've been there. This is what my art looked like when I started rendering about a month ago, and this is mine now. It's not perfect, but it's a pretty big difference from when I started. And in this video, I'm going to be showing you how. More specifically, we're going to get comfortable working with the basics of shadows. So, no color yet. Because when colors get involved, it can get pretty complicated. Part 2 will be how we turn from black and white to color. Before we start shading the face, we need to learn about the basics on how shadows work. And we can illustrate this with a simple shape, an egg. There's different types of shadows going on here, some lighter and some darker than others. And unless you're a camera or a photorealistic artist, it's impossible to capture all the nuances of each shadow. So we artists categorize them into 5 groups, or the 5 values, from lightest to darkest. Number 1, or the lightest shade, is the center light, also known as the highlights. And this is where the light hits the egg. Number 2, or the second lightest shade, is the halftones, basically showing the transition between the light and the core shadow. We'll get to that, what the core shadow is, in a bit. Number 3 is a shade darker than the halftones, and they're the midtones, so they're also part of the transition between the light and the core shadow. Number 4 is the second darkest, and is the reflected light, which is part of the egg that's not getting hit by the highlights, but is getting some softer light that's bounced off the floor or the surface that the egg is sitting in. This shade can also be used for the cast shadow, which is the shadow of the thing blocking the light source, in this case the egg. And number 5, lastly, the darkest value belongs to the core and the occlusion shadow, which is the darkest parts of the egg that doesn't get any light at all. One thing to note is that these aren't fixed rules. Sometimes the reflected light can be as light as level 2 or 3, and it all just depends on how strong the light and the surrounding light is. Another point is that the darkest points of the picture aren't always pitch black, while the highlights aren't always stark white. If we're in a room with a lot of surrounding light, our darkest shadows aren't going to have the same value as an egg with only one light source or a very weak light source. But there will always be a range, and this 5 value system can be used in any lighting situation to break the values down in digestible categories. Besides different lighting conditions like the high contrast versus ambient lighting we saw before, we can even see the 5 value system play out when the light is in different positions, like when there is side light, top light, or even a backlight. So definitely a very good system to keep in mind. An excellent video explaining this concept is Proko's video, where he explains these different types of shadows and why they happen. So we now understand how shadows work on a simple shape, but what about a face, where it's not one single shape, nor is it a smooth surface? To simplify this concept, let's reduce the face into a single shape and work our way into the features from there. We go from one shape to various small shapes for each facial feature, to a point where the shapes meld together to form the planes of the face. Now let's see it in action. We're going to be using this photo as a reference because it has strong shadows and outlines, so it's easier to differentiate the shadows. I usually start with the darkest shades, which is the core and occlusion shadows. Here we can see the core shadow lining down the middle of her face where light and reflected light doesn't hit. And I can also see some occlusion shadows below her nose and lip. A level lighter than that is the cast shadow, which I outlined in blue. These are shadows that are created from her nose and her lips, so it's blocking the light and casting that shadow to the other half of her face. Then we can move on to the lighter areas. Here I outline the halftones in purple and pink. No need to worry about why I'm marking this in a different color, since we're only doing black and white now. But this becomes an important concept when we render it in color, in part 2. These are the transitional shadows between the highlights and the cast and core shadows, and this will be the base of her face. Lastly, I outlined the highlights in yellow. These are going to be the brightest parts of the face. Once we've grouped these, we can get started on the rendering. I shade everything in the same color as the halftone in her cheeks, since this covers the majority of her face. To guide the coloring process, I outline the darkest shadows, like the occlusion and the core shadows, and highlights first, as they're the easiest to point out. Then I move on to the cast shadows, as they're the next and darkest. And with that, our guidelines are done. This is the magic of guidelines. With just a few steps, we can already see how the picture is going to turn out without getting bogged down by the details. And this is what I mean by treating the face as one big shape before we go down to each facial feature. When you place the face side by side with the egg, it follows similar rules as the egg. The core shadow and the highlight placements are in the same regions. The halftones surround the highlights, and the reflected lights stay opposite from the highlight and across the core. The occlusion shadows also go below each shape. The cast shadow also falls below the face, but unlike the egg, it's also evident in areas where there are protrusions from the face, like the nose and the lips. Now we can proceed with making sure that the transitions are smooth between light and dark parts. As you can see, I used the rest of the time to shade in any areas I missed, like the forehead, the cupid's bow, and the eyes. I also blend in any rough shadows and redefine some parts where it's too blended, kind of like a sculptor, polishing and smoothing some areas and then redefining and sharpening other areas of her sculpture. This is where I focus on defining her features. To define and sharpen these specific areas, I make the shadows darker, the highlights brighter, and use a harder brush to establish shapes. And then just keep doing this until you're satisfied with the results. So what about images where the shadows aren't as defined? Let's use this image as an example. Here, the girl is surrounded by soft lighting throughout. There isn't one strong light source illuminating a part of her face and making a stark shadow. Instead, there's lights everywhere, which makes the shadows less defined. If you're not careful, you can end up with a very mushy look like this. For this case, I've been turning to Simplify Painting and Drawings video to guide the process. He recommended to start with the highlights first, since these values stand out the most. So I map out the highlights first and then move on to the cast shadows, which are the darkest in this picture. Similar to the other picture, the base layer is the same value as the halftone, and then we start adding the cast shadows, the highlights, and then blend everything together. And then we start sculpting. So we sharpen some areas and push back other details back into the picture. And that's it. Some tips to remember: always start your rendering with markers to guide your rendering process. I like to mark with the darkest shadows and the highlights and then start working on the halftones after. This is what happened when I first started, when I went straight into rendering without the markers. The facial features aren't defined well and the shadows don't seem to follow a cohesive story. Overall, the picture looks really messy. Before we end, another resource I like to use is this model of the head, which shows how each plane of the face reacts to different lighting. Use it when you want a better understanding on what's causing the shadows. And finally, stay tuned for part 2, where I'll talk about how to turn your black and white portraits into colored ones.